From the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, the Science Bag, the series where faculty members from university science departments share their special interests with you. And now, the Mirage, the Discovery of Greenland, and the Green Flash with Professor Robert Greenler.
The mirages that I'm going to talk about tonight are real in the sense that you can see them, your friends standing next to you can see them, you can take a picture of them, so they're real. You've probably seen on the Midway or perhaps the Funhouse the curved mirrors. You stand in front of one of them and you look like a wine glass, and you move to the next one and there you are like a bowling pin, and then there's the one that makes you look like a basketball, and then there's the one that looks like a telephone pole. But every one of those things that you see is an image of yourself, distorted by the curvature of the reflecting surface. And so the mirages that I'm going to talk about are very similar to that. They are views of real parts of the landscape, distorted in passing through an atmosphere that sometimes acts as kind of a large distorting lens, giving them strange and sometimes unfamiliar shapes. I will show you a demonstration which illustrates the principle on which all the mirages that I'm going to show you tonight depend. I have a laser here which can shine through this tank of water. I can change the height of this laser, and as I do it, you see the beam comes across to this water tank, through the tank, and then across to the cardboard. So as I tip this laser beam up, the point of light goes up on the cardboard, just as you would expect, until I get to a certain point and something strange starts to happen. I'm still raising the laser beam, but that beam is changing its direction in a very strange way. Can you see it coming through the tank that is following a curved path? Let me put a little chalk dust in the laser beam here so you can see the whole thing, and you can see the strange path that this laser is taking. Now what you're seeing here is this laser beam following a curved path through this water tank because I don't have a uniform tank full of water. What I have is some fresh water layered on top of salt water, and you get the curved path. Now I can show that same thing happening in the atmosphere. Here I show a beam of light coming from a distant star, and these little lines crossing the light ray are like the wave fronts. If you were talking about a water wave traveling, these would be the little ripples on the top of the ridges. The thing that causes this ray to take a curved path is the fact that the density of the atmosphere close to the Earth is greater than it is higher up, and the light travels slower in the dense atmosphere. So if you look at one of these little wave fronts, the lower end of it is always down in the denser atmosphere, traveling slower, which continually holds back the lower end, tips the wave front down, and the ray takes the curved path. I'm going to talk a lot about that, so let's get an easy way to remember which way the ray bends. The ray bends so that it goes into the denser air. What's the effect of that for the observer? When you look at something, you make the assumption, without ever thinking about it, that light travels in straight lines. And so when this fellow sees this path, this ray coming into his eye from that direction, without thinking about it, he assumes that the object from which it's coming is in that direction. And so he sees the apparent position of the object raised above what its real position is. Now, unless you know the positions of the stars pretty well, that may not be very dramatic to see those closest to the horizon raised above their usual position. The effect is greatest close to the horizon, and it goes to no effect directly overhead. However, there is a common situation where you can see that effect. Here's a picture I took of the sun through a telescope behind the radio tower. I think that's a very pretty picture. It's one of the reasons I showed it to you. But do you also see that sun is somewhat flattened? Imagine the sun sitting right on the horizon. Actually, when the sun sits right on the horizon, this effect that I told you about is about the magnitude such that the sun appearing to sit on the horizon actually is just below the horizon. And the curved path is letting you see it when it's actually should be hidden below the horizon where light to travel in straight lines. So imagine the bottom part of the sun and the top part of the sun both raised by this bent ray, but the bottom part is raised more than the upper part. You see, if the bottom part is raised more, that will tend to flatten the sun, to squash it out. Sometimes that's a dramatic effect. Here's another picture through a telescope. You can see it slightly flattened as the sun gets closer to the horizon. Sometimes it's quite dramatic. What I'm talking about here is something that takes place over a very large scale. I'm saying the air is not uniform due to the change in air pressure. It's denser closer to the surface. But most of the mirage effects have to do with a non-uniformity of the air that's within a few feet of the Earth's surface. And the thing that varies is not pressure, but temperature. Let's consider the case of that desert mirage first, where the sun shines on the desert, heats it, the floor of the desert very hot compared to the air. And so the air right next to the desert floor is hotter than it is up a little ways than it is higher up. And this variation can be very strong over a few feet next to the sand. The air that's heated expands and is less dense. So remember, our rule which says that the light tends to bend toward the denser air, in this case where temperature is the main effect, would say it tends to bend toward the cooler air. So the light rays which come closest to this very hot desert get bent the most. Now there's an important point that I want to make here. I've showed several rays which come from, say, light that's scattered from the tip of this leaf, taking different paths through the atmosphere. Two of those come to the observer's eye. The only way this observer can get any information about that tree is by rays which come to her eye. So all of these other rays mean nothing in terms of what she sees when she looks at that tree. Could you straighten that projector around a little bit, pull it to center it again? It's been bumped. Someone sitting next to the projector, just push it sideways. Thank you. All right, I'll show you a diagram here where I'm only going to draw those rays that come to the observer's eye. There are two rays from here which can take different paths through the atmosphere and end up at her eye. Only two. There are two from this point. Now, look at this from the observer's point of view. With that top ray, looking in this direction, she sees the top of the tree. Actually, she sees it a little bit below its true position. This class of mirages are referred to as an inferior mirage, not because of some lack of aesthetic charm, but because the image that you see is below in an inferior position to the real object. All right, but looking out here, she sees a tree which looks about right. She looks down with this ray. She sees the trunk of the tree. When she looks down farther in this direction, she sees a ray which comes from the trunk of the tree again. And when she looks in this direction, she sees the top of the tree. The top of the tree, the trunk, the bottom, the trunk, the top. What she sees is a tree, and underneath it an inverted image. Where in nature do you ever see anything like that? A tree on the other side of a body of water. And so the way your mind interprets this is to say, there must be a body of water there. Let me show you some familiar scenes from this, taken on local roads on a summer day. The road looks wet. Why does it look wet? It looks wet because you apparently see things reflected in it. You see the car, you see the telephone poles. Here's an interesting thing. You apparently see things reflected about a line here. That is, the dots down the middle of the road appear to be reflected. The motorcyclists, of course. Looks for all the world like a reflection. Now there's sort of a strange one. Although it looks on a hill, you get the distinct impression that that's wet. Why? Because here you see the tree above it, as if it were a reflection. Over here you see the sky. All these things. There's a sun glinting off the windshield of this truck, which gives a whole row of reflections. And for your immediate impression is the road is wet. What do you make out of that? That's a little strange. A little bit later I took the picture. This was not very far away in Michigan. A few moments later, whatever it was approaching. And sure enough, you begin to recognize what it is. I'm going to show you another effect which will enable you to understand some more things about the kind of pictures you just saw. Look again at this. What I've really sort of done is draw these rays backwards as if they came from the person's eyes, and I drew rays pointing in all different directions. What does a person see when he looks in that direction, the top of the tree? What if he looks down a little bit? He sees the trunk of the tree. When he looks down a little bit farther in this direction, he sees the monkey. When he looks farther down yet, he sees the trunk of the tree. Looking in this direction, he gets light coming from that point on the trunk, and looking down lower yet, he sees the top of the tree. Now, a very interesting thing here is that there is no direction that man can look and see a clump of grass at the bottom of the tree. It is as if there is a vanishing line, in the case I've drawn right through the monkey. He sees nothing below that except an apparent reflection of what is actually above that. All right, now that, whether you follow all the reasoning for this, remember that idea. For the hot road mirage that we're dealing with, or the desert mirage, there is a vanishing line below which you cannot see anything that's really there, and about which you will see an apparent reflection of the things above it. As you move farther away, the vanishing line rises. So if a person moved back from this, the vanishing line might rise to the top of the tree, and this is the thing the person would see. Now let me talk more about the desert mirage. In fact, I've made a little desert for you here to produce a desert mirage. I have a little desert scene. I've made this one a little modern along with the palm trees. I've put in the camel, I've put an oil derrick and a VW. And underneath I have a pipe with holes in it through which I can run gas, which I can light to heat up the floor of my desert. Now, I mentioned that as you move farther away from something, the vanishing line rises. It's also true that the vanishing line on a distant scene rises as you move your point of view closer to the surface. So after this is over, I suggest that you come up here, and the desert should be good and hot then. Close one eye, and as you move down here, you should see a puddle of water appearing, a vanishing line, which as you lower your eye, rises, and you begin to lose some of the details on the bottom and see an apparent reflection. Now, I would like everybody to see this so we can talk about it at the same time. So I've taken some pictures of that, which I will show you. All right, with my camera raised a little bit off the plane of the sand, I look down and see the scene essentially normal. A little bit fuzzy because of the waviness, the heat waves in the atmosphere. But you'll notice that you can see everything here. You see the bottom of the wheels of the Volkswagen, the ground, everything. Now, I lower the viewpoint of my camera a little bit, and you're going to see a vanishing line appear. Look at this little tree here, so that you miss most of the trunk of the tree. Well, not quite yet. Does it look like there's a puddle of water there? Certainly does. A vanishing line, something like this, with things reflected through it. You can see the reflected legs of the camel. I get down a little bit lower yet, and the vanishing line rises. And now you see it's as if there were a reflection here, and you don't see anything that was on that scene below that. You've lost most of the trunk of this little tree. You've lost the bottom of the derrick. And one more picture raises the vanishing line until the VW. It's completely over the top of the VW, which disappears. We've almost lost this. So this little tabletop desert mirage shows all the classical features of a real desert mirage. This is a schematic representation of what would happen as a person moved away in the desert when there were strong mirage conditions. The vanishing line rises with distance, so the person standing here, you can see the whole person. Here he would be apparently reflected about his ankles, here reflected about his hips, and as he walked farther away beyond this, he would disappear. So you could imagine the appearance of this being someone moving off into the water rising. You, of course, see the reflected part of what's above the water until he disappears under the surface of the water. There's an article written a few years ago by a meteorologist named Fraser at Penn State, which he entitled Theological Optics. Fraser suggested that we are impressed with these natural atmospheric phenomena today, and we try hard to understand what causes them. There's no reason to think that people a few thousand years ago did anything different. They did not have some of the tools that we have to ask the question, how can that be? And so the best answer that they came up with frequently had to do with supernatural or theological explanations. And so Fraser looked at some old stories about people's interpretations of something they saw and said, let's consider how the same story might be treated in terms of known effects of atmospheric optics. One of the things that he looked at was the story of the Israelites fleeing from Pharaoh's army in the desert. And we are told that the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea upon the dry ground, and that the waters were a wall onto them on their right hand and on their left, and suggests that they might not have been in the Red Sea at all, but in the desert when there was a very strong mirage, in which case everything would be hidden below the vanishing line. It would appear that there was water everywhere around. And of course, as you read how the sea parted as they moved, of course, as they move along, the wall of water continues to recede from them and follow behind them. Think about how such conditions would change overnight. When the sun is directly overhead at noon, the desert floor would be the hottest, the mirage conditions would be the closest, the water would appear to be nearby. As the sun gets lower in the sky, and in the evening as the desert begins to cool, the water would appear to recede. You would be able to see the floor of the desert out farther. And of course, when it gets hot the next day, it would come back. And we read that Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all night. And later Moses stretched forth his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to his strength when the morning appeared. 3,000-year-old record, which would describe rather well how you would expect a strong desert mirage to vary with the day and night. And as the mirage came in, of course, you can see that someone so far away would appear to disappear, would disappear as if he were drowned under the water. And we read that the waters returned and covered all the host of Pharaoh. There remained not so much as a one of them. Now, if only we could get a hold of the Egyptian writings on this, we would find out that they saw all the Israelites drowned under the water, not a one of them remaining. Mirage conditions are recognized to cause strange troubles sometimes. There was a report of a British general concerning a battle in 1917 between the English and the Turks in Mesopotamia, where in the official report, the British commander said the fighting had to be temporarily suspended owing to a mirage. And you can imagine the strange feeling knowing that there are a bunch of people, there's an army right there, perhaps nearby, and you can't see them. They're below the vanishing line, and of course, the situation is symmetrical. You're here, and you're below their vanishing line. So the only thing to do is to call off the war, I guess. Maybe there's an idea there. I'll show you another set of pictures here of this red truck moving off into the desert mirage. And of course, I have exaggerated all of these by taking this with a very long telephoto lens. And so on the road, you could get some of this view by looking with binoculars. I have exaggerated it by the lens that I've used. All right, you see the truck here. As it drives off, you begin to see a vanishing line. I think you've cut off a little bit of the tires, but the truck appears to be reflected there. You can see the license plate above and below. Okay, here we've lost the tires. The vanishing line has, at that distance, has risen. You can still see the license plates reflected. The next picture, we're looking at it under the oncoming truck. And finally, you see this strange thing floating in the water. And a short time later, it disappeared entirely, although it was probably within straight line sight of where I was standing. This idea of the vanishing line will enable you to understand some other things, which you've probably seen. For instance, if you're out in a boat in the summertime, have you ever noticed that distant islands seem to have a strange shape? Consider the effect on these islands of a vanishing line. Suppose the top row represents the islands the way they would really look if there were no funny business in the atmosphere. The mirage conditions creating a vanishing line would show you an apparent reflection of the island above the vanishing line. But depending on the details of how the temperature changes, frequently one or the other of these images is magnified or demagnified, and commonly this lower part is demagnified, so you end up with islands looking something like that. Now let me show you some pictures and see if this doesn't look familiar. All right, here's an island in Lake Michigan. It appears as if everything is reflected about a line here, and then the lower part is diminished in size. Here's some islands off in the distance. If I lowered my viewpoint 4 feet from this, the vanishing line on those distant islands raised, and they almost disappeared. If I went right down to the edge of the water, I could not see them anymore, because then the vanishing line was over the top of the islands. Okay, every feature here below you can relate to a feature above it. Now these were taken right off the lakefront in Milwaukee. What on earth are these white things floating in the sky out there? The answer is there's some pieces of ice floating out there. The vanishing line is partway up on the ice chunk, and so you see this floating mirage with the shape of the islands that we just talked about. You see this frequently. This again is from the lakefront. You can understand that scene if you consider what you're looking at is mirage conditions that produces a vanishing line there. Now, on the day that I took this picture, as I recall, the air temperature was below zero. It was a very cold day. I went out on the ice and looked at the shore, and it certainly looks as if there's a reflection line there. Now, I've been explaining all of this in terms of the desert mirage. Well, it didn't feel like a desert that morning. I was freezing my hands trying to take these pictures in below zero temperature. But what do you suppose the temperature of the ice over the lake was? Well, the water was 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and the ice, which was in good contact with it, was probably about 32 degrees. So compared to the air temperature, the ice was hot. So the conditions to get the desert mirage are that the ground be hotter than the air above it, and that's fulfilled in this situation, and the conditions we see are just the same as the desert mirage. However, there are times when you get another condition. You get the condition where warm air flows over a cold surface, like a lake, and so as you go up from the surface, the air gets colder rather than warmer. Meteorologists call a layer of cold air or warm air trapped over cold air temperature inversion. And this causes the rays to bend downward into the colder air, producing a whole different set of mirages. The simplest one might be just something like this. A boat out here appears to be raised. Again, perhaps not too impressive. Just looks, it's a little higher than you would have expected to see. However, depending on the nature of the temperature distribution, sometimes these rays get turned and you get strange effects. Perhaps the most famous of these effects is a class of mirages called the Fata Morgana, named the Italian name for the fairy Morgan, who was the legendary half-sister of King Arthur, a woman who was reputed to have great magical powers such that she could create out of thin air cities with towers and castles and turrets. And I have photographed some of her handiwork. looking over the Arctic Ocean. Here is a shed set up where people were doing some work testing the properties of ice. And the Arctic Ocean went out here as a flat, rough surface, and usually it just spread off to the horizon as you would expect it. But on this day, the Fata Morgana had built a wall on the ice right out there. And she had made some towers, and if you walk out on the ice, these things would disappear. Well, you can either believe in the, you can answer the question by saying the Fata Morgana has done it again, or you can understand from a physical picture. Suppose the temperature increased as you went up in just the right way so that a ray from, let's say, this point on the ice came to your eye, and a ray which started off in a different direction, several different directions, all came to your eye. Now, that takes a very special temperature change to produce exactly that. But if you had that, what would you see? Well, you look up there in the direction of this ray, and you would see this chunk of ice. If you look down there, you see the same chunk of ice, and there and there. So what you see is that chunk of ice drawn up into a big vertical image. And do you see that if you had that along the surface of the ocean, what you could get is the appearance of a wall? Indeed. Amazing. Now, you might be a little skeptical saying, did you really go out and look at that to be sure that there's nothing there? I mean, it certainly does look real. And the answer is no, I didn't. On the other hand, I stood in the same place where I took this picture, and I lowered my camera about 1 foot and took another picture. And then I lowered my camera about 3 more feet and took another picture. And if I went clear down to the edge of the Arctic Ocean, there were no projections there at all. So the Fata Morgana had been at work again, building her castles out of thin air. Now, you might have rays 1, 2, and 4, let's say, coming to your eye, so you would see parts of that wall, but it might be that the temperature distribution is here that ray 3 would miss you. And so you might expect to see that wall sometimes with gaps in it. And you can do that. Now, the conditions that you get this, let me give you a name to this class of mirages. The image that you see is apparently above the position of the real object, and so this is called a superior mirage. Again, not having to do with its quality, but just the fact that you get an apparent displacement above the real image. The condition in my saltwater tank here is just the one to produce that kind of a mirage. It will bring rays on a curve downward. So I have drawn some little objects here, one just to look like the surface of the ice, another one to look like the surface of rough ice. I put these back here, and I have photographed them, and I'll show you the kind of images that I can see. All right, there's my attempts at representing the surface of the ocean, looking through the tank, and then I raise my eye a little bit closer to this thing which acts like a temperature inversion, and I see it drawn out into a wall, I think not unlike some of the pictures I showed you. The other rough ice is shown here looking through the tank, magnified a little bit by the mirage conditions, but if I move my head slightly, my camera in this case, I see this sort of a fantastic creature. Well, who has ever seen anything that looks like that? The Fata Morgana and her powers are impressive indeed. There's a record that was published of a person who in England looked out one day over the North Sea and saw strange things, strange appearance of the ships moving up and down the North Sea. So he set up his telescope and drew what he saw and published these. This was in the year 1799. Now, this is one thing that he saw. The top of a ship, an inverted ship, and another one here. Another time he saw ships like this, one apparently upside down in the sky. Another ship here similar to this. Another effect of these conditions that causes a superior mirage is it enables you to look over the curvature of the Earth to see beyond the horizon. I'll illustrate the effect here. If light traveled in straight lines, then you could see something a distance d away only if you and the other thing were at some height above the surface of the ground. And I figured out some conditions here. First I said, suppose your height were 5 feet, that is the distance to the top of your eyes. How far away, if light traveled in straight lines, would you have to move until another person a similar height would be disappearing below the, due to the curvature of the Earth? And the answer is 5 miles. So you think of this as being a flat Earth. On the other hand, the curvature over a 5 mile distance would be such as to hide a person, an object 5 feet tall from your view. If you made it 50 feet tall, height of a 4-story building like the one you're in, people on the top of two such buildings could see each other no farther than 17 miles away if light traveled in straight lines. Or 500 feet, a 40-story building, something like the tall building in downtown Milwaukee, the tallest building, could be seen from 55 miles away. Now, I've picked a number of 85 miles here for the reason that it's the distance between Milwaukee on the west side of Lake Michigan across to the town of Grand Haven in Michigan on the east side of Lake Michigan. I have a newspaper article, 1977, which describes one night when the people in Grand Haven looked westward over the lake and saw lights across there, which appeared to be the lights of a city. They were standing on the beach. They could only see a few buildings. They went up to the top of a sand dune about 60 feet tall and could see tall buildings and short buildings. They could see the city of Milwaukee outlined against the sky in the lights. Now, if light traveled in straight lines, you would have to have something 1,200 feet high on both sides of the lake. They were about 60 feet high. They saw a red light which was blinking, and one of them, I thought this was very interesting, one of them had the people in Grand Haven had the wit to call someone, to time the light, time how fast it was blinking, call someone in Milwaukee, and found out that its frequency matched that of the light at the mouth of the Milwaukee Harbor, not very high above the water, beaming eastward over the lake. And so across the lake, 85 miles away, they were seeing Lake Michigan, and that night the Weather Service reported a strong inversion layer over the lake. So they were using the mirage to see over the normal horizon.